Hi everyone, good morning. It's really nice to see so many of you here. Some familiar faces from yesterday, and thanks for joining us online. We're so pleased to be sponsoring this event. I'm Louise and I'm from OVO. For those of you who don't know, OVO is a green energy company with a mission to drive progress towards zero carbon living. And today is all about sustainable pleasures. So what does that mean? It means, can we do the things that we love without impacting the planet? Kicking us off this morning, we're asking the big question, a life without carbon, can we get there? We've got four great panelists. We've got Kunle Barker from Kilo by Kilo, Hannah Dillon from the Zero Carbon Campaign, Rebecca Heaton from OVO, and Nadia Yang from One Young World, all expertly chaired by Lucy Siegel. Thank you so much for joining us. And just one more thing. For those of you who want to ask questions, we are using Slido. So please download the URL. But yeah, take it away.
Thank you, Louise. Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see you. It's so amazing to be here in this brilliant venue. I'm with four incredibly impressive people that Louise has just introduced us to. I'm going to start by asking you just to explain a little bit about what you do and where your focus is, because it's always better rather than me reading out a biography, because as I say, they're all very, very impressive. So we're talking about a life without carbon. Can we get there? I'm hoping no one's going to say no, because it'll be a short conversation. But we'll see. We'll see. So Hannah, let's start with you. I also want to know, it's such a COP question, but how you're feeling this morning. And if you could kind of wrap into that, any announcements that you think have come out of that blue zone place. Yeah, and you can give us, out of 10, but you can give us a 0.5, 0.6, so we can get really accurate about how you're feeling.
I'm feeling very tired this morning, but otherwise quite optimistic. So I'm Hannah, I run the Zero Carbon Campaign. We are an environmental advocacy campaign, and we focus a lot on the various policy levers that can be used to facilitate the transition to zero or low carbon living in a way that enables kind of participation from everyone across society, so it's not just about a select group of people who have the money to be able to make low carbon choices, but really thinking about accessibility and kind of thinking about circumstance, and regardless of circumstance enabling participation. We focus particularly on policy levers such as carbon pricing, which I can talk about in a second. So yeah, we're campaigners. Basically, you might have seen there's a big display up over on that side at the top. Make sure you check it out if you haven't yet, which we ran on Tuesday with a bunch of youth activists and organisers who, I think if you asked them how they were feeling, the answer would be slightly less optimistic about the commitments coming out. But one of the roles that we do is bring people together to discuss these issues. I haven't been hugely involved in the blue zone stuff. We've been hanging out on the fringes a bit more. I think one of the key things to remember about all of this, and obviously we're all here and believe in COP, otherwise you wouldn't have bothered to make the journey up here, but it is also just a milestone, and it's been really useful from a UK perspective for holding the government's feet to the fire in terms of making sure we don't make any, let's say, hypocritical commitments in advance of COP, but it's also just the starting point on a journey to facilitate the transition towards low carbon. You want a score from me, don't you?
I do.
I'm going to say there have been some really good financial commitments. There's been some people coming to the table that might not necessarily have been expected to, so I'm going to go for 6.23 out of 10, noting that there's a lot further to go.
That's quite good.
I'm feeling optimistic. It's a sunny day.
And when you said there's been some commitments that from countries that you hadn't expected, then are you thinking about anything in particular?
Yeah, so I was thinking about some of the coal commitments today, but also some of the stuff on deforestation is really exciting. I think one of the concerns, though, is that we're still talking about 2030, right? So you hear that all these countries have come together, and UK and Indonesia are working together, and there's loads of money going into these things, but we're still saying we're going to end illegal deforestation in 9 years' time. Which, I mean, is there going to be anything left by that point, which is quite... As some wag said yesterday,
Bolsonaro will have destroyed the Amazon by 2030, so there'll be nothing left for him to protect. But, you know, that was a cynical person. But yes, I take your point. 6.3, though, not bad. Maybe we'll come back to you at the end and see if it's still there or not. Thank you so much, Hannah. Rebecca from OVO, tell us a little bit about your job, and I'd love your score, please.
So I'm Becky. I'm working in sustainability at OVO. So you might know us as an electricity supply company, but we're actually so much more. We're really partnering with our customers to help us all achieve zero carbon living. So we're doing this through energy efficiency and through heat decarbonisation and through using our customers' electric vehicles as sort of mini power stations, so connecting them up to the grid and supplying electricity to the grid when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. I'm also very lucky. I've only been at OVO 2 months, and I've inherited this fantastic thing called Plan Zero. And I'm calling it a thing because it's not a sustainability strategy, it's not a business strategy. It's kind of both pushed together. It's so much more, and it's embedded in absolutely everything we do. Every meeting starts with talking about Plan Zero, which is how we're going to get to net zero by 2030. What do I think about COP? So I've been working in climate change for over 25 years, and I remember when COPs were things that no one had ever heard of. So I do feel really encouraged to be here with this energy and with this enthusiasm. I have been quite impressed by how leaders are standing up and making pronouncements. I'm a forester, so I watched the deforestation one with great interest. I actually feel really quite encouraged by it because although they may have a target of 2030, there's a journey to get there. So it's not going to be that we continue full tilt and then just stop in 2030. We're on a journey. So I was encouraged by that, actually. I'm also really just a born optimist, so I'm afraid you can't work in climate change for as long as I have and not just, stick at it and be optimistic, so I am. So I'm going to say 8.97.
Ooh, I didn't know we'd get to that today. Oh my God, that's really discombobulating. Wow, okay, that's amazing. So I'm really sorry I called you Rebecca, which probably only teachers at school did if you were in trouble. Becky. And, I don't meet that many foresters, so could I just have a little bit? You described yourself as a forester.
I am, so I have a degree in forestry and a PhD in forestry and climate change. So it's great. We need more foresters, right, in Britain. I just want to say this. I know it's not quite so linked to OVO, but because we need to plant all these trees, which OVO are doing. We're going to make a big pronouncement as well at the weekend about some tree planting that we're doing. So we do need to plant trees, and that means we need foresters. So go off and go and train and be a forester because we need to know how to do this.
That is brilliant. Yes, right tree, right place, though, but we won't get into a forestry debate. Am I the only person here without a PhD, by the way?
No. I don't know.
Oh, thank God, thank God. Few. Like most journalists, I've got very basic qualifications, let's put it that way. Okay, Kunle, let's talk to you now. Tell me about yourself and how you're feeling. Give me a score.
Okay, well, I'll start. So I am Kunle Barker. I am COO of Melt Property, and we're a small boutique developer, and we do as much as we can in terms of sustainable development and sustainability. So that's about how developers, when they install anything that's sustainable, how do we pay for that? Because it has to be paid for. And we're working with companies, people like Kenza, to find ways of making those things pay for themselves so that it becomes something that developers want to do. I also am a non-exec director at an architects firm called Studio Agno, who recently got planning for the country's first not only zero carbon housing development, but zero construction waste development as well.
Which is really important, isn't it? Because construction waste is kind of one of the biggest waste streams in the UK.
Oh, it's incredible. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. And there's lots of things, like modular construction that cut that waste down by about 70%. So we can talk about that later. I also write for the Architects Journal, and I do some broadcasting, and we had a show out with ITV recently called Save Money, My Beautiful Green Home, and that was really about showing people about little things that they can do to be more sustainable. Not necessarily the huge things like air source heat pumps and solar panels, but what can you do in terms of just fitting the kitchen, for example? What should you be looking at to be more sustainable? How do you reuse materials, etc., and get a kitchen from a sustainable source? And really one of the things I'm here at COP, and I've travelled up in an electric car from London yesterday, and I stopped off at my old school, which was fantastic actually to see how engaged the kids were. I went to a school called Bedford Modern, and I met some year 6s and some year 12s and 13s, and it was just incredible. And made me almost feel like, well, there's nothing really to worry about. This is what's coming through. They are so much smarter than I was when I was their age, and I told them that, and way more engaged than I was when I was their age. And and talking about sustainability and know absolutely everything. And that was even the year sixes knew everything, knew what COP was, knew what sustainability was, knew how to save carbon. It was mind-blowing. And so that was great. And my real thing is about how can we encourage people to do everything they can, because I think some people can be disincentivized to do sustainable, to make sustainable changes, because the rhetoric around it is just so overwhelming, and it's expensive, and it's complicated, and it's confusing. And they say, well, I can't do that, so I won't bother doing anything. And the idea is that actually, that's not the message we should be giving. The message we should be giving is every single kilo of carbon that you save, and if we all do something, and we all do as much as we can, then effectively kilo by kilo, we can get to that the net zero target. And that's what I'm doing up here at COP, launching a campaign called Kilo by Kilo, which is all about that.
That's such a brilliantly clear framing, and I love, your question is basically, do you know how to save carbon? Like, it's just such a brilliant cut through. I've honestly never thought about posing that question in that way. It's really, really good.
I asked the year 6 kids, do you know how to save carbon? They all put their hands up. They talked about harvesting rainwater. They talked about turning down their boiler. They talked about, they knew every single type of carbon saving you could make. They knew what it was. It was just incredible.
Yeah, and linking those actions to net zero and to straight into carbon and emissions cuts. Very clever. I have to ask you a couple of things. What electric car do you drive? Where is your old school? And do they have a charging point?
Did they have a charging point? No, I don't think they did, actually. I didn't ask them, actually, but I don't think they did.
Where did you charge your car?
I charged my car at, I think we stopped at Rugby Services, and because they have the fast chargers. And so there was an article in the Times at the weekend my dad sent me, and they were like, someone did the drive up from Westminster to COP and complained furiously about there being no chargers and queues. And my dad said, oh my God, how are you going to get that? I said, well, that's ridiculous, because there's apps, and the apps tell you if they're all being used. So why would you go to a place where there's queues? And it was absolutely fine. And in fact, we sat in Rugby Station. I had to do some, because I have a real job as well, so I had to do some emails. And as I'm emailing, a little note comes up, oh, you're up at 100%. And I said to Gareth, who was doing the video with me, I said, Gareth, we've got to go. And he said, how long was that? I said, I don't know, probably 20 minutes, 30 minutes or something. So the infrastructure isn't what, it's not there. There's lots of work to do. If we all turned to EVs tomorrow, there'd be a big problem, obviously. But it's not as bad as people think.
What car do you have?
I have a Mercedes EQC.
Ooh, very nice.
Which I love very much.
I love that your dad sent you that article. It's exactly the sort of thing that my dad would send me. How are you going to get... Yeah, I'm already on the road, so thank you. Yes, brilliant, thank you. Nadia, you were nodding at a lot of what Kunle was saying there around the infrastructure's not there, so we'll get to that in a moment. Tell us about you, and also, would you just tell us a little bit about some of the stuff that you've done at COP26 so far? Because you've been on some very impressive panels.
Yes, so I'm Nadia. I'm currently a One Young World ambassador, so yes, thank you. I like that. I'm also the president of the European Young Engineers, which is Europe's largest young engineering organization, so we are about 500,000 young engineers, but we have not been that good in social media. This is why probably not many people know it so far, which will change. So my vision is to bridge the gap between policy and technology, just because my impression is that policy is super important. This is why we are all here gathered at COP26. But it's nice that now scientists have an ear from the policymakers, so people listen to what climate scientists are saying. But my impression is, from the technological perspective, not a lot of policymakers do understand really when they decide upon decisions like how far wind turbines should be apart, that they actually do know what implications that would have. And when I was working, for example, in the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy in Germany back then, I was one of the only ones with an energy, with an engineering degree. And
I was in the energy department. So I was wondering, so how do you figure out what would be the best? And this is usually from external advisors. But I do think it would make a change if policymakers, or at least people in the middle of policymaking, would understand technology better. This is why, for example, my organization is building up the first network for European engineers in politics, where we bring together politicians from all over Europe with STEM backgrounds, so that they first of all have a platform to discuss, but also secondly to encourage more young people like me who are really interested in policy making, but who really do not have access as, for example, as engineers. People always ask me, how did you enter like the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy? Like, what was the process, etc. So this is really far away from people who are in this kind of technology bubble. So this is one part. Oh. And I'm also currently a PhD candidate at, so I'm on my way, hopefully. And at the University of Oxford as a systems engineer. And I'm trying to see how we can transform cities to become regenerative, biodiverse, and carbon neutral. So my research topic is called Urban Circular Bioeconomy. And yes.
Urban Circular
Bioeconomy.
Bioeconomy.
That's correct. Okay. Because I really want to see how we can create cities where we would not regret the consequences anymore. So now, I liked Antonio Guterres' quote. He said we shouldn't treat the planet as a toilet. And I think we shouldn't treat anything as a toilet, like no resources as a toilet. Like I was interviewing farmers actually in Oxfordshire, and they were also saying, you know, there are so many resources actually from the toilet, for example, but like cities do not really use it. So for example, cities are right now one-way pathways. So they are resource sinks, but I really want to see how can you adapt them more similarly to nature, because nature is regenerative.
Amazing, and you brought us so into some really fascinating hints about solutions, which is cool. Could you just very briefly tell us about, so we were talking before and you were telling me about a panel that you'd been on with, was it the Namibian president?
Yes. Okay, to be fair, I was not with him on the panel, but I was chatting with him a little bit.
You talked to him.
I talked a little bit with him, and it was about green hydrogen, because Namibia is trying to get the reputation of the cheapest hydrogen country. And they have a lot of collaborations with German companies. So I'm originally from Germany, but also with other European countries. So there was at least the Minister for Energy of Belgium, for example, present, etc., etc. So the collaboration between European countries and or like more southern countries is trying to be enhanced, because obviously Europe does not have so much like solar, for example, as like African countries or more southern countries. And what I wanted to point out about the president of Namibia was that he was really, at least he took the time, he was chatting a little bit with me. And I know a lot of like German youth delegates who really wanted to talk to high officials of the German government. Like not necessarily Merkel, but like, you know, a little bit lower levels. But they didn't want to take the time, or at least they didn't have the 10 minutes in the next week as well. So this is what I found interesting. I had so much easy access to, for example, the president of Namibia or Kenya to chat to, instead of my own country, which I found sad. I mean, there are so many endeavors that youth and policymakers can talk to each other. But I think like on the lower level, like which are not in front of the camera, it's not always the case.
Yeah, and well, I don't need to tell this audience this, because this is what you exist for. But yes, I was listening to Outrage and Optimism on the way here, the brilliant podcast from Christiana Figueres and Tom and Paul, and they did say that. I think they said only 4 NGO leaders are involved in any high-level talks, only 4. I mean, that's kind of crazy. And then they also said that they hadn't really seen any of the youth climate leaders. And we know that you are here. I know, because I've personally been involved in crowdfunding for two. You know, that's all the funds that I could raise. And by the way, I raised those funds in 3 hours. So the public really, really want you guys to be here. But it's like, yeah, why is that blockage still happening? So that's a whole different debate, but do reference it. I would like to go straight into the solutions, because Nadia's started talking about those. Hannah, I'd like it if you could tell us from your perspective what a zero carbon future is going to feel like, be like, and any sort of hallmarks or characteristics that you think it will have. And you made the point very well that you are thinking about different socioeconomic groups, and I'd like you to talk about that audience as well.
Yeah, sure. So there's been a lot of focus recently, which is really positive, on the benefits of this transition. So there's a big debate at the moment, absolutely fair enough, that it might cost a lot of money and maybe we can't do it and all of that, but actually turns out that focusing on the positives that can come from it is a good thing too, because we're all very aware of what the negatives are and unfortunately are experiencing them to various degrees. Quite a wake-up call, particularly for people in the UK that think climate change isn't going to affect them recently with all the flooding and things like that. And in terms of benefits, there are so many things we can talk about. So WWF have done a massive study on this, not just financial benefits in terms of unlocking £90 billion per year of what are described as co-benefits of the transition, which includes things like reduced air pollution. We're all going to be more productive. The NHS isn't going to be so stressed. There'll be more trees, there'll be more time to connect with nature. So there's so many positives, but there are a lot of things we need to do to facilitate that transition. And one of the things we're focused on is saying, let's not shy away from the fact that people have to play a role in this transition. So the Climate Change Committee in the UK have estimated that about 62% of the emissions reductions required to, emissions reductions in the UK to achieve our net zero target have to come from people. So what can we do to enable people to make those changes? And in terms of solutions, what we focus on as a campaign is carbon pricing, which is a somewhat technocratic mechanism, but we're trying to make it a bit more popular, which is essentially saying that we should attach a cost to the production of greenhouse gas emissions, because that will incentivize those producing them to produce fewer of them, because it's going to cost them money, but also drive investments in low carbon solutions rather than high carbon ones, and shift the tax system so that we're not actively incentivizing high carbon behaviors. So for example, at the moment, you would have all seen this debate, I'm sure. Actually, that's a really broad thing to say. I'm sure all of you would have seen this. But it costs people 3 times less to get up from London to Glasgow by plane than by train, because we're actively incentivizing the wrong sorts of transport. So what we're saying is you can rearrange that system, introduce a cost to the production of greenhouse gas emissions, and crucially use the revenues from doing so to support households and marginalised groups and vulnerable households through the transition. I mentioned that we're campaigners. We run a big campaign on this. We launched a big petition. We got over 100,000 signatures on a petition that called for 3 things, which is ending fossil fuel subsidies, so let's stop paying people to pollute, introduce a cost to the production of greenhouse gas emissions, and then off the back of those 2 decisions, use that money to fund people through the transition. And on a global level, which is relevant from a COP perspective, only 22% of the greenhouse gases emitted across the world currently have a cost attached to them, so like any penalty at all. And the average cost attached to the production of 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions is $2, which of course in some countries is going to incentivize change, but in a lot of countries it's not. And from a UK perspective, we only attach a cost to about 1/3 of the emissions that are produced in the UK, which means things like waste incineration. Waste incinerators are disproportionately placed in deprived areas. They cause air pollution, they cause a huge amount of rubbish. But because the burning of waste produces energy, they don't have to pay a carbon price at all, even though the energy that they produce is relatively high carbon. So we need to shift the incentives, we need to think about marginalised groups, we need to include everyone in the transition, and make this not a question of sacrifice or saying you can't fly or you can't eat meat, but just making the easiest choice the low carbon one and the most convenient one. So that's what we think about a lot.
Yeah, there's loads to unpack in there. That's brilliant. Thank you. I mean, just on the energy from waste, I did a dispatches for Channel 4 last year, and we actually found that quite a lot of the energy from waste, try not to call them incinerator plants, were not always producing the energy. So that is, yes, a very difficult area. And most people don't know that their rubbish goes to incineration now. They just have no idea.
Or that where those energy from waste plants are disproportionately, they will have an impact. So where you have one of these plants, recycling levels go down because they get paid to burn this waste. So we're burning plastic, but we're not, and then we're making energy or not from it, and then we're claiming it's a low carbon thing to do.
Yes, and you can check it out because I think it's still on the Channel 4 website. It's called, what's it called? The Dirty Truth about something. Every documentary thing I make has the word dirty or rubbish next to my face in all of them. Anyway, that's just another thing. So you're talking about carbon budgets and you're really humanising, because basically in that blue zone, it's Article 6, yes, isn't it? Yeah. And also known as, I think, the sort of the markets regime or something really not very sexy or enticing. But it's a very difficult one to grasp, and there's a sense of fear that it will turn into the debacle that we had before, which was the CDM or whatever it is, where basically the floor price was set so low and it wasn't equitable and it was just basically a bit of a disaster. How confident are you that we can get to something that actually works?
Yeah, feeling quite confident. So yeah, what we're trying to do is make carbon pricing cool. But actually, we work with a whole bunch of artists and grassroots activists to think about this, and we do a huge amount of opinion polling. And I think what you just touched on is really important. There's a perception in political circles that we just shouldn't touch this or do anything about it. But actually, people are really open to learning about this stuff and, you know, ensuring that those producing the most pollution are actually helping fund the transition. So it's not completely mad to suggest that this is something we should think about, but of course you need to be open and transparent and talk about the way that this is going to work, and you need to think about things like phasing. So rather than saying we need to introduce a carbon price on everything tomorrow, you could say, okay, maybe we could borrow from some of the future revenues of that carbon price, invest in helping people make the changes they need to make, and then saying in 5-10 years time is when you're going to bring that price in. So you're not penalising people at the start, you're saying here are all the tools and the funding that you need to make those changes. If you don't, there will be a penalty, but at least giving people that choice and thinking about phasing. And I think even in the last, I've only been working on this campaign for 2 years, but we've seen a big shift in kind of consideration of the role that carbon pricing can play, but critically that question of equity as well, how you use the revenues. If you look at an EU level, they're talking about extending carbon pricing more broadly across other sectors of the economy, but they're also talking about creating kind of social funds where you can invest that money in people as well. So certainly when I started, this felt like a relatively niche policy area, but we've seen, and this isn't, I'm absolutely not taking credit for this, this is around the world, it becoming a much more relevant topic. And like you say, Article 6, the technocratic negotiations, talking about carbon price floors, that's all pretty technocratic, but it's also really important because, like I said, if 3/4 of the emissions around the world can be produced for free, then how are you going to stop people producing them? So
exactly, and also unless we understand a bit about what's going on, how are we going to hold them to account? Because we do need to understand it. What's the name of your campaign that makes carbon pricing cool?
Makes carbon pricing cool. That's like a good tagline. The Zero Carbon Campaign. But what I did want to say as well is, I know we're talking about a kind of future of no carbon. I think we need to be a bit careful to avoid this sort of carbon-only lens, because if we just think about emissions intensity alone, there can be negative consequences. I know I'm sitting next to a forest, so we need to think about biodiversity, all these other things, as well as equity, inclusion, waste, because if you just look at one aspect of this, you could very well have kind of negative consequences elsewhere. You mentioned right tree, right place. Yeah. I think what we're talking about is a holistic approach that thinks about all of these different dimensions.
Yeah, and of course, is it Friday is Nature Day, which is the first time that that's really been brought into the COP process. So that's kind of, well, about time, but yes, interesting. Thank you very much for that. Just coming to you, Becky. So we heard a little bit about some of the things that you're excited about. So, for example, you said you were using your customers' cars as little mini power grids. Yes. So tell us more about what this transition will feel like.
So I think we have to accept it. We are going to be living differently. So how we heat our homes, how we cook, how we travel, it is going to change. But I think it could change definitely for the better. So we particularly talk about the EV trial. So we ran the world's largest trial of EV batteries, using our customers' batteries to supply electricity back to the grid when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And I think we're seeing at the moment the real need for as much power as we can get in those circumstances. And we found that our customers on average earned £400. So they earned £400 from having an electric car. And one customer earned £800 a year from doing that. So I worry quite a lot about the just transition, and I think there is an issue with EVs and the just transition, and we don't want to end up with, I've got lots of friends who won't spend more than 500 quid on a car. We could end up in a stage where, petrol stations are few and far between. So there is that issue. But I am generally really positive about EVs in the future. I think we've kind of overcome a lot of those hurdles. I think heat decarbonisation is a much tougher nut to crack, and that's something at OVO we're working with the government on. So we're running a trial of heat heat pumps in customers' houses to try and really understand the challenges and what we can do. And I'm quite passionate about this because I think if we can get heat pumps right, we can actually change lives for the better. So this is really something that we can help. I grew up in my 20s and 30s living in really damp, cold cottages in Wales, and it's grim. And it really affects your quality of life. And I did a sort of tour around South Wales last year looking at heat pumps in people's houses. And there were some families living off gas grid, and they said, we have never been warm. You know, my children spend their time under their duvets in their bedrooms in the evening. Now we have this heat pump. We are all together in the living room in the evenings. This is life-changing. So I think there can be some real positives. But it is tough because it is going to be quite expensive. So I think we do need some government help here, and that's not necessarily money. I think that's enablers as well. And if you look at the government's recent net zero strategy, it's actually really pretty good. Now, I used to sit on the Committee on Climate Change and produce these annual progress reports, and they were all, it was hard to be positive. You'd be going, right, can I try and tick some boxes here? And there weren't often that many boxes to tick, certainly not in last year's. I think next year's annual progress report to Parliament is going to be much more positive because they had ticked off an awful lot of things. There are some gaps, but really pretty good.
Just from your insight, what's happened? Have they sort of woken up? Because again, somebody expressed it again in the Outrage and Optimism podcast, which I cannot recommend enough, by the way. They were saying, oh, it's like Boris has woken up. And then somebody said, maybe he's just reading his briefs. But
I don't know, Boris, I can't comment, but when you look at what they're doing, they're certainly making the right moves. I think they're seeing the opportunities here, because there are definitely opportunities for businesses, for technology, for us to be a leader. So hopefully that's kind of the driver and the absolute imperative that we have to do this.
Just to let you know, could you start thinking about questions as well, by the way, and you can use the Slido thing, which I don't, you're going to help me with that, aren't you? Thank God. So Kunle, when I hear Becky talk about, you know, families that have never been warm, I just feel really angry that we haven't managed to address, well, I just don't feel like we've made efforts to address fuel poverty, and it seems to be quite an abstract notion, and it's like that needs to be our absolute focus to me, or it needs a lot more energy going that way. What do you think?
I think you're exactly right. So fuel poverty, the issues surrounding that are linked to the solutions that we're going to be discussing, because it's linked to using less or needing to use less. If you need less energy, then you need less money. So less people will suffer from fuel poverty. And that all goes from a change in the country's thinking on energy. At the moment, what we're concerned with is how expensive is it? And now, where does it come from? That's not as relevant as how do I stop using energy? So if I insulate my home, a passive house, everybody that I know who has a passive house tells me the same thing. I don't turn my heating on, right? So that's how you beat fuel poverty, by not needing to use fuel. That is also, conversely, the solution to the problems we're all talking about at COP. And earlier on, you asked if we will get to net zero. Well, 100% we're going to get to net zero. We're going to do it in one of two ways. One way is that we would continue the trajectory we are when you consider that the world needs to get down to about 25 kilotons of carbon emissions. We're on target at the moment for about 56. Now, if we don't change that, that will lead, I think, probably to a temperature rise by the end of the century of 4, maybe even 5 degrees. That will lead to effectively a breakdown of all society, economics, and governments. So that will propel us back to the Middle Ages, so we'll get to net zero that way. Or that's one way. The other way to get to net zero is that we all pull together and that we do something now. And it's multifaceted, and it is all about changing, and that's what I'm trying to do with Kilo by Kilo, is change the way people think about consumption. Consume less. That's across the board, so that's not just in terms of your energy, that's in terms of food, or how you consume, or waste less so that you buy less effectively. Your clothing. If you do have to buy things, get them from reusable sources, or get them from sustainable sources. I mean, it's the only way that we'll really get to that target. And the problem you know, the problem is that figure that I said earlier about the 56 gigatons, that's based actually on all the promises that were made at the previous COP in Paris in 2015 and the ones they've made already, because most of the governments sort of signed up to the promises they were announcing now over the last year. So even with if everybody did everything, every single country did everything they promised to do, we're still not there, not even close. You know, we're still looking at a 4-degree rise. You know, put into perspective, even at a 3-degree rise, so there was a 3-degree rise about 3 million years ago, and it meant that sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than they are now. So just think about that. You know, that's not even, and that's somewhere in between the two figures of where we need to be and where we're going. Yeah. So that means kind of, you know, forget about the Maldives, forget about southern India, Holland's gone, and it goes on and on and on and on. So whilst I'm positive about us getting there, I think, you know, the message needs to be, okay, enough rhetoric, you know, and to paraphrase Greta, you know, no blah, 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 let's get rid of that and let's do something. They need to do something, and we're not doing enough.
I think there was some research out reported on the front page of the Times today from the University of Melbourne saying that the current actions or announcements from COP26 add up to 1.9 degrees. And then you think, well, we're at 1.1 already, and I was talking to Professor Gail Whiteman from Arctic Base Camp, which you should definitely go tomorrow, by the way. She was saying that already in terms of Arctic melt, in Greenland alone, she's got these amazing mineral water bottles, and the water is from melted glaciers. Like, it's all right to drink, it's been tested and everything, which she's trying to get into the blue zone, so that's their official water. And she said, so these are large bottles, and it's, the melt at the moment is per second 17 million of these bottles. Yeah. That's in terms of ice melt. So that's at 1.1 degrees. So 1.9, if that's true, and everyone holds right to their targets, yeah, nowhere near enough.
I think that also the problem is that those figures about temperature rises are from pre-industrial times. It's not 1.9 from now. Yeah. It's 1.9 from like 150 years, I guess, pre-industrial revolution. Yeah. So we already used most of that up. Whatever, you know, that carbon budget we've used most of that up already. And also to put that into, even at 1.5. That's an average. So what we're actually talking about, even if we hit 1.5, what we're really talking about is on the hottest days in the hottest countries, they will see 4-degree rise. So that's places like Riyadh and stuff will be up in the mid-50s, 60s. It's just, you can't live in places like that. So there's a lot. I worry a little bit about the amount of rhetoric and about, oh, we're going to be here in 2030 and that'll be fine. It's good that we're all talking about it, but I think that needs to be the real message, so that it's kind of like everybody listening, watching. Yeah. When you leave here, go and do something. Yeah. Go and save a kilo of carbon. Go and do something to reduce your carbon footprint, because if you don't, well.
While we're talking about it, when we leave here, what should we do? What's the first thing that we should do?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, look at your homes. So the built environment accounts for 40% of the UK's carbon footprint. So look at your homes. Simple things. Turn your boiler down from, it's normally up at 70, turn it down to 40 degrees. When you have a shower, you're using hot water, then you're turning on cold water. You're undoing something you've just done, you know. So just heat it up to the temperature that is comfortable for you. If you can't afford things like underfloor heating or heat pumps, then you can buy TRVs with those little valves, thermostat valves that go on radiators. Some of them are electronic, they're fantastic. And they even know when you've got a window open, and when the window's open, they'll turn the radiator off. And then you can zone the room so you're not heating the entire house. Move your thermostat from the hallway. Why is it in the hallway? I don't know. Yeah, the hallways, that's not meant to be warm. So we go to someone's house and they've got a thermostat in the hallway, and they're like, oh God, it's bloody hot in here, isn't it? And then they go to why is the heating still on? Well, it's because the hallway's like 15 degrees and you're sat in the living room, which is 25.
My sister's house.
Right, exactly. So move, buy these wireless thermostats and put them in the rooms you're actually using.
Okay.
Lots of things.
That's great. Those are great tips, especially the bossy radiator valves. I love them, and they know when you've opened the window. Okay, Nadia, I would like you to give us, before we take some questions, I'd like you to give us a sense of what this world could look like from the benefit of all your insight, being part of the group that's going to create it from a technological perspective.
Well, I think first of all, as I mentioned, we do need to bring youth more on the table, and not only in front of the camera, but also really like get engaged with them, and not just like for the image, but for the real purpose. Secondly, yes, from the engineering perspective, I do care a lot about systems thinking. We talked about sector coupling, actually, when you mentioned how cars can be used as batteries. So how can we look from a whole systemic perspective? How can we integrate technologies that it's not only like one silo and one silo and one silo, but can integrate them to a whole system that can be sustainable? So for example, we talked about heat. Cities are on average a little bit warmer than the surrounding. So nowadays people are thinking, how can we use the excess heat, because it's actually not beneficial for the city to be hotter, but it can be beneficial, for example, for plants, to grow more plants in the cities. How can we integrate those kind of different feedback loops? So this is one from the systemic perspective. Technologies, I think a lot of people who do not people do not understand entirely what the technologies would be about, or what it would take. And this is where I would like to encourage, especially technologically more adept people, to get engaged in the public debate, because from my peers, I know a lot of people who don't want to be part of the public debate. They're so fed up by their studies already that they're happy to go home and sleep and to have just a chilled beer in the evening. But I think
That sounds quite nice, actually.
I mean, it is very important to have your chill time as well. But I do think every person has a potential, but not every person sees the potential in themselves, that they can be a contributor to a better world. And this is why I want every person, every young person, every older, but also like every person in the world to just to look at yourself in the mirror and see your potential, and then see your talents and contribute with your talents. And young people just have a couple of more years to do that. And I mean, we talked about mindset shift today. You talked about insulation of the house. To be honest, I was thinking back when I was in Shanghai. Like Shanghai is a huge city in China, right? And it is considered to be one of the most advanced, but usually people do not have heaters. But it is really cold in the winter. So my aunt was buying like a really, really thick kind of clothes for me, and I looked like a cotton candy. And today in the morning, it was also really cold. And I had the decision between turning on the heater or just wear a few more clothes. Right now I'm wearing 3 layers, for example, because I am more a person who feels coldness quicker. But now, like, I personally would prefer to be less fashionable, for example, and rather don't do the unnecessary things in my eyes. But okay, like traveling, for example, is also like carbon intensive in some ways. But I do think there are benefits of like exchanging, like having all of you together here to have this mutual exchange. And I would really, in Germany, you would say you grab yourself on your nose and think about like how you really want to live your life with the consequences you can bear with. So for me, less fashionable is okay. For me, for example, I also I told you, or we discussed that in the UK, sheep farming is a big thing, but the cotton, for example, is just burned because it's of no value. Why is it? Like, why are we burning wool, which can warm us up? But why do we heat our buildings up? I don't think it's logical.
Don't start me on a fashion textiles thing, and I will just briefly answer that. Is because the fast fashion industry dominates the market and floods the market with cheap synthetics. So, you know, you were talking about Wales and damp houses. I've done a lot of filming in parts of Wales where kids are dressed in plastics, and they weather those all-in-one suits in the winter, and they don't have, you know, they didn't necessarily have coats, so out playing in that, there was no thermal warmth in that whatsoever. And meanwhile, we are burning wool. It's a market distortion. And it's been allowed to happen, but we're working on it. Okay, I won't get sidetracked too much this morning. Does anyone have any questions for our panel? Or our panel might have questions for each other, because that would also be good. Yes?
Could I get the optimism scores from the 2 and the
Oh my God, I forgot, didn't I? Yes, yes, you never gave me an optimism score.
Okay, I'll give you 2.
Yeah.
Rhetoric, 9. That's very optimistic. The reality, probably 5 at best.
Okay, thank you. Nadia?
I think I'm really much on the middle ground, so a 5. Just because I'm happy that there are countries that are really influential in the world finally committing, for example, to certain pledges, at least in the next 50 years. But I mean, at least I think I got the grasp that all of us are really keen on having an accelerated progress, which makes me frustrated too. So I'm a 50-50.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And actually, if you want to ask a question, do give us a score. So you've got some questions that have come in, okay? Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
My name's Millie.
Millie, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. We've had an anonymous question through, just following on from what you said as well. My government announced targets from 2070. What can young leaders do to encourage governments and companies to stop moving the goalposts back and delaying action?
Okay, who'd like to go first on that? Anybody? Or I was going to choose you anyway.
Oh, I'm relatively youngish. I think that we should recognise the role that young people have made in getting us to where we are today, right? So you've mentioned, and it's a very key point to raise, is like a lot of companies are putting pictures of Greta with a protest sign in their document and saying we need to do this for young people, but not including young people in their decision making. But none of this would even be being recognised had young people not used their voices and started to hold people to account and started to totally shift the narrative away from by 2070 we're going to do something to like real people are really suffering here, and there's swathes of generations that are going to have a really concerning time. So I think we should recognise that young people have already played a massive role. And I think that in terms of, there was a question as well about what we can personally do. I think advocacy is a super important action that people can take. I mean, on a really micro level, and this is by no means global, but from our campaign, we were saying, use your voice, you can sign a petition and it will trigger a debate in Parliament, which means the government has to respond to it. Whether or not their response is adequate, we can leave that as an open question, but you can take an action that generates meaningful change. That's what we're focused on as well. So I don't get the sense that 2070 targets are going to be accepted. I certainly think there's a huge amount of people, not just young people, indigenous communities, a whole bunch of different people that have a role in changing that and really should, because A, it helps with climate anxiety if you're doing something to try and address it, but also we've seen that it can generate meaningful change already.
I would say, just 5 years ago, people were not talking about climate change all the time at all. People would say to me, what's it you do? Oh, climate change, is that a thing? That was just 5 years ago, really, yeah. And now, everyone's talking about it. And governments do have to listen. We're voting for them. So we want governments who are going to do this. So just get out there and talk about it, like we're doing now, but even more.
Yes, okay, Kunle.
I don't mind. I think that it was either India or Pakistan moved the target back, so I think that's probably what they're referring to. I don't necessarily mind that because we've got to stop getting focused on targets and buzzwords. We're focused on what people are doing. China, for example, biggest polluter, but they actually also, they in terms of coal, they use more, I think, than everybody else put together, but they also generate more renewable energy than anybody else put together. They're going to stop funding coal projects now, when they are ready to shift, because they're in a different trajectory in terms of, we've had our industrial revolution and some other countries haven't. But when they are ready to shift over, when they do shift over to renewables, it will make a huge difference. And I think we've got to understand that countries are at different points, or at different stages, and allow them to get to where we need them to get to, and not use that as an excuse for people to say, well, I heard a lot of, there was some stuff on Twitter, and I heard, China aren't at COP26. That's not true, actually. That is just not true. So, if they don't do anything, then we might as well not bother. And that's just not the case. So get away from buzzwords and get away from targets and focus on what are people actually doing, and how is that going to help things.
Yeah, I read a lot of that, especially on Twitter. When you're on Twitter and then you come up here, it's like, oh, okay. I was in such a negative, I was like really ground down, and then I got here and I was like, it's happening. Yeah, and I think China has its most senior climate negotiator here, Xi Zhenhao, and yeah, it's, you know, yeah. I also think that is an India question. The 2070 suggests that it's an India question, but that is actually quite a significant commitment when you look at the detail, because isn't it like half of the grid to renewables? It's like a really big shift. Nadia, did you want to add anything on that?
Yes. So I personally really believe economic incentive is one of the key drivers, especially for developing countries. And I mean, as a single person, it's so hard to economically incentivize a country, right? But you can make decisions that, like following where things are coming from, for example, whether it was made like on a renewable basis or not. This is like one small thing that you can do. Ideally, in the future, like countries like India would see it as even more like economically feasible to be like regenerative, like renewable quicker than other countries are. At least what I understood from the Chinese perspective is that they were thinking also economically that it makes sense to be quick with the process. So this is where China is at the moment. And yeah, and on the other hand, like I think what activism is also really important, and I think people should continue with this. I mean, we could see, for example, the farmers just last year it was a really sad process, and they went on the street because they were emotional about it, and people could feel it. I had so many friends who were advocating for it because there was also an emotional attachment. And I think, I'm not sure what like policymakers themselves are thinking on a personal level, because like now we talk about 1.1 degrees or something, but you can feel something more if there's suddenly, you said 70 million tons of waters, right? Like this is another kind of number. And I think we need to picture even more and more what each of our like steps bear as consequences. And at some point, if for example, I was someone really important in policymaking, if I lost like a brother or something because I knew my action led to this, maybe at some point, personally speaking, it will also be. But I think on the larger strategic perspective, it's economics.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any more questions? Or shout if you have a question and you're in here. Yeah.
We have a few more. I can just say one more and then maybe see if there's any audience questions as well. So we have one from Sandra from Germany asking, what specific innovations are you most excited about regarding securing a carbon-free future?
Let's start with you, Nadia, and we'll just do a quick fire round.
Oh, so many.
You have to pick some. I know that's very unfair.
I know. I mean, I'm personally very big on circular economy and also recycling or sharing platforms. So sharing platforms and how to reduce the consumption of resources, I really like Airbnb or those kind of platforms are important. But also, I personally believe waste to energy is not like the most ideal. It's like the most practical, so to say. But like identifying how you can really make use of resources on a higher value. This is what I find exciting. And there are so many also carbon removal is one of the topics that people would discuss as like controversial. But I think, like I have friends, for example, they try to use the ocean as a, like try to push the ocean to be more like a natural kind of carbon removal base. And I do think like thinking with the nature and nature-based solutions, etc., are like the exciting movement.
Yeah, well, Ocean Day is Friday, Nature Day is Saturday, and there'll be a lot of talking about the ocean as a nature-based solution. Yes, thank you. Kunle.
Anything around sustainable energy production, so hydrogen, the increased advances in solar technology, battery technology, the shift, or this talk of being able to shift car batteries once they deplete to home batteries. For me, anything around how much, producing as much sustainable energy as we can is, for me, is great.
I think we've got the technological solutions that we need. I think there were maybe more breakthroughs which might make things happen quicker or more cheaply. But we do know, particularly in the UK, we know that we can do what we've got all the solutions in place. It's about getting on with it. I'm most excited about homes though, and what we can do in people's homes. And I think we will see, better heat pumps. We might see some hydrogen somewhere. I think all that's going to help us decarbonise homes, and that's probably the thing I'm most excited about.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think a lot of the technological solutions already exist. We need to incentivize investment in them, but we also need to not overly assume that technology is going to solve the problem, because the nature point is really important too, and there's really exciting things going on in farming that aren't even that technology based. It's about diversification of land use and encouraging people to think differently about forcing things to grow in spaces where they naturally shouldn't grow, and thinking more about what is right to grow in that space, and maybe not focusing on one crop but a variety of crops. So the ingenuity that people can bring to harness the power of nature to help deliver the transition.
You sound like you've said that before.
I haven't.
Brilliant. I'm going to add one. I really am interested in geothermal energy, and Eden Project has had a drill rig which I was lucky enough to go and see, and there's a guy who runs it. He's a Texan oil man called Terry, and he's come over to Cornwall to run the geothermal rig. And I said to him, because I was doing presenting a TV thing, and you always have to say, so what's your job, Terry? And Terry said, my job is to look for hot water, man. And I just thought it was amazing. And I think, unfortunately, you've been able to go and see it because there's a special tour you can do, but I think they've actually got to the depth they need, and they've got to the temperature they need. So the drilling rig's coming out in a couple of days, so rush down there if you want to see it. Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions in the audience here? Yes, Amber.
Hannah, I think this one's probably for you, but talking about carbon pricing, I know I've heard from other people before that the UK government are not super happy about the idea of embracing it, if the rest of Europe don't embrace it, and all the other countries too. How much of this conversation is actually happening in the Blue Zone at the moment, and likelihood of ever getting global consensus on carbon pricing?
I'm a born optimist, so I'll give a bit more of a positive response to this. I think, so certainly in the last 2 years, we've seen a shift in the way that the UK government is engaging with that, and people expressing interest in this policy is a helpful lever. The UK government, for example, have committed to exploring extending carbon pricing across the 2/3 of our economy that aren't yet priced. They're looking at carbon pricing in agriculture. It's a really tricky conversation, but they're trying to work their way through it. There was a lot in some of the recent government strategies relating to carbon pricing, so it's definitely being thought about, but the international dimensions are really tricky. I think we will move on it. I think Europe will move on it, and the UK won't follow. They will help lead to make that movement happen with lots of different nations together. And we talked about Article 6. People feel very uncomfortable, but there is this unresolved element of the Paris Agreement. So I think it will get solved. And I do certainly, I haven't been working in this for particularly long, but I certainly see that there is a recognition that one nation moving on this alone, great to show leadership, but actually you kind of screw yourself over by making your own economy super low carbon, because you're just going to suffer competition from abroad. So I think there's a recognition, you want to shy away from the word protectionism, but there's a recognition that there's a benefit in everyone moving together, and COP is a good forum in which to have that discussion. So I'm feeling optimistic. I think it has to happen. I mean, if you want people to stop polluting, you've got to force them to. And what do people listen to? Well, if their profits are going down as a result of it. So
yeah, and I absolutely agree. And also, this is what we're here for, and this is why all the negotiators are there, and this is a negotiation. If you are really interested in this, you could go to Carbon Brief, which is an excellent website, but they do get into the detail, and they've got this incredible table, and it shows you on Article 6 which country their red lines, where they're likely to move, blah blah blah. So if you really want to, Amber, you can follow it. But yeah, it's just not possible, and it's not feasible to keep dragging Article 6 into the next COP and the next COP. It has to be solved. It has to be signed off for the rule book. Otherwise, what are we doing? That's their job. They should do their job. Okay, Millie. Oh, and we've got a question here as well. Let's take yours because you're here. Thank you. Sorry, Millie. Thank you for being so.
Thanks so much for the discussion so far. Jonah Messinger, I'm a One Young World Ambassador. My question, I wanted to pull on the sort of net zero commitment by 2070 that India made. I wanted to pull on that thread a little bit more. I suppose, for a country that just a couple years ago, I think it was, had something like 250 million people that had zero access to electricity, plenty more that were sort of manifestly energy poor. Sort of how can there be critique from, I think the BBC had a headline, wealthier nations sort of calling for that commitment to be a 2050 commitment. Sort of how can they possibly make that ask of India, considering the conditions that they're under?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more of a statement, right? I mean, we did sort of agree with you. I don't know if you've got anything you want to add.
It's like I said earlier, you know, it's unfair to judge everybody, you know, by the same stick. And to be, I don't know where we get the gall to say things like that, because we're not going to hit the targets either. So we can set targets all we want. We are not going to hit the targets we have set right now. We're not going to hit them. So.
I also noticed a few people coming out and saying, "Oh, 2070, that's terrible." High-profile people, and then rowing back and saying, actually, sorry, gone away, look at the details, sorry. I think it's almost like a bit of a reflex thing. And it's, you know, everyone should be better than that, because as I say, there's professional negotiators here. This is the point. So, yeah, exactly. And I think probably in the public discourse, the problem is that we always talk about annual carbon emissions. China this, blah, blah, blah. And we never really acknowledge the fact, and it hasn't been polite to, because Biden's been in town, that the US is historically the biggest carbon emitter still by a long way. So I think the whole thing is skewed. We're out of time. Is there like an amazing question that everyone could give, like?
We've had some really good questions. I think following on from your question, it was, we've had a question in from Greece. Sophia's asking, how should the disproportionate consequences of climate change inform our strategy on climate mitigations and solutions? So just any quick comments about that?
Blimey, that's quite an intellectual, quick-fire conversation. Go on, Hannah.
I think the point that was just raised is super important, and for those nations who've been through these transitions, it's really important to export that expertise and invest it in developing nations, because climate change doesn't have any borders. We're all going to suffer from the consequences of it, and we have to take responsibility there. So I think that's a really important point. There's so much that someone like the UK could teach India. We also need to think about, in terms of what we've been through and the shortcuts you can take, we also need to think about financing, right? We've just cut our international finance commitments and then criticizing other people's targets. There's a lot of money that we can invest, and you know, if we want to act selfishly, it is a selfish thing to do, because we're looking out for our own interests, because we're all going to suffer if we don't do it. So I think collective action, and again, that comes back to the importance of COP that we shouldn't forget, is like, if everyone's working together, we can help solve these issues rather than place blame.
Okay, anyone else want to add?
I think it's definitely a fairness thing. If you look at the UK Climate Change Act, that talks about what's the fair amount that you should do as a country. And you know, the UK is, I think, number 5 historically as in terms of cumulative emissions over time.
Yes.
So that's why I think we should be doing rather more in the UK. Our contribution should be more. And we also have we have laws, we have a stable government. We have no reason not to do more.
I'm not going to comment on the stuff. Yes.
Stop thinking about things in terms of geographical border targets. Think about the world target. So I say again, the world target is we have to get down to about 25 gigatons of carbon. It doesn't matter how we do it or who does it, we've just got to do it. So let's just all pull together and get to that point.
Yes, I do consider myself as a global citizen as well, but I also agree. In terms of, for example, the UK, it was one of the pioneers of industrialization. And it's true it had so many more centuries of time to actually adapt. So my policy is, my policy in general in life is to first look at your own and look what you do yourself instead of focusing on criticizing others. So look at what is the phrase, look at the specks in the eye? How do you say it in English?
Say it again.
The speck and the bulk in the eye. How do you say this in English?
The whites of the eye. Whites of the eye? What does it mean?
Yeah, exactly. If you have a split in the eye, don't always focus on the bulk in the other person's eye. So this is my general policy, and like my mantra in life, but also for nations.
Wow, that's great. I'm taking that with me. Thank you so much. Well, on that note and on that learning, thank you very much. Oh, thank you, all of you. Thank you for that lovely intervention as well. That's a very important intervention. Thanks for coming, but thank you again to an amazing panel, to Nadia, to Kunle, to Becky, and to Hannah. Thank you so much. And to you, Louise, for OVO, and to you, Amber, from One Young World. Thank you so much. Not me.
wonderful host.